Greetings from First United Methodist Church of Los Alamos, New Mexico. We hope this message will be meaningful and relevant to your life and your relationship with God. We invite you to join us for worship on Sunday mornings. We have now resumed in-person worship with one service at 10 a.m., which is live streamed both on Facebook and on YouTube. We alternate each week between contemporary and traditional music. You may confirm worship times and receive more information by visiting our website, firstinyourheart.org. Now may you be blessed through the reading and hearing of God's holy word.
Our first reading is from the book of Numbers. After fleeing slavery in Egypt, as they are approaching the promised land, Moses sends spies into Canaan to scout the land and the people. Most of the spies return and say that the Canaanites are too strong to be overcome, although Joshua and Caleb said to trust in the Lord, which the people were unwilling to do. God questions why the people refuse to trust, and Moses argues on their behalf and asks God to forgive them. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. And now, therefore, let the power of the Lord be great in the way that you promised when you spoke, saying, "The Lord is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquity and transgression, but by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the parents upon the children to the third and the fourth generation. Forgive the iniquity of this people according to the greatness of your steadfast love, just as you have pardoned this people from Egypt even until now." Then the Lord said, "I do forgive, just as you have asked." Our second reading is from the Gospel of John. Jesus and the disciples have been traveling as Jesus teaches and heals, as well as being challenged by the religious authorities. When he comes across a man who is blind, and the question of who is responsible for his blindness is raised. As Jesus walked along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him." When he said this, he spat on the ground and made mud with the saliva and spread the mud on the man's eyes, saying to him, "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. Then he went and washed and came back able to see. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar began to ask, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" Some were saying, "It is he." Others were saying, "No, but it is someone like him." He kept saying, "I am the man." But they kept asking him, "Then how were your eyes opened?" He answered, "The man called Jesus made mud and spread it on my eyes and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' Then I went and washed and received my sight." They said to him, "Where is he?" He said, "I do not know." They brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. Then the Pharisees also began to ask him how he had received his sight. He said to them, "He put mud on my eyes. Then I washed, and now I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not observe the Sabbath." But others said, "How can a man who is a sinner perform such signs?" And they were divided. So they said again to the blind man, "What do you say about him? It was your eyes he opened." He said, "He is a prophet. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. They answered him, "You were born entirely in sins, and you are trying to teach us?" And they drove him out. Jesus heard that they had driven him out. And when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered, "Who is he, sir? Tell me so that I may believe in him." Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and the one speaking with you is he." He said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshiped him. Jesus said, "I came into this world for judgment, so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind." This is the good news of Jesus Christ.
Thanks be to God. So in that passage we just heard from the book of Numbers, and bad news to the physicist, it has nothing to do with mathematics, it's counting people. It says that God will punish people for the sins of others, iniquity, such a great word, up to the third and the fourth generation. Injunction, it also appears in Exodus and Deuteronomy. And there certainly seems to be a part of that for the disciples asking Jesus about this blind man, whether it's his parents' iniquities or his own that has caused him to be blind. And Jesus discounts that, as we see in other places as well, that we are only responsible for our own sins, not those of others. And we like to think that's the case, right? That it's just on us. These things don't pass down generationally. And yet, that's actually not the case. There are things that pass generationally. Let's just start with genetic issues. I'm a diabetic, which has dietary issues of how to manage that and can cause diabetes. But there's also a genetic component to diabetes. I'm a third generation diabetic. More than likely, it probably goes back farther than that. They just weren't diagnosed with it. Mental illness also has genetic components, which also runs in my family. Addiction also has genetic components, which runs multiple generations in Linda's family, which means our children are messed up even before they were born with their genetic makeup. That these things pass on generation by generation. And then there are the other things that can also be passed on generationally, right? We talk about generational wealth. Poverty can also be passed on generationally. The scriptures have a lot to say about that. Anger, how we treat each other, how we deal with conflict, these can be generational as well. Which then leads us into the final film we look at in our gospel in Pixar, which is one of the top vote getters, and it is the film Coco. Released in 2017, it was a 19th Pixar film, and it takes place in Mexico during the Day of the Dead, centering on the Rivera family. And before we dig more into that film and the message I want to highlight, one of the practices or beliefs about the Day of the Dead is it a time to honor and to celebrate our ancestors, those who have come before us. And it's believed that their souls can come back to earth on this day, not to haunt us, or it's not scary as we sort of think of Halloween, but instead it's a time of celebration and celebrating again what our ancestors have passed on to us, what they've given to us. Part of that practice within Mexican culture is to put up what are known as ofrenda, which are pictures of the ancestors, and then you put up things that remind you that are important to them, also including food and water. And I will note that best guess is that this practice has its origins in indigenous culture in Latin America, but have been clearly adopted within Roman Catholic tradition and practice within Mexican culture, just as we as European have adapted other things, non-Christian things, and made them Christian, called syncretization. But since this is not the culture or practice for most of us, I asked Philip, who comes from a Mexican culture, and his grandmother was doing this as we were talking about this in preparation for this series, to give us some more background to help us better understand what they're doing.
Thank you, John. In this picture, you can see my grandmother and her children. The only spoken language she knew was Spanish. My mother speaks both English and Spanish, and I almost failed 9th grade Spanish. The moment I knew I was in trouble in that class was on day 1, when my teacher asked the class how to say son or daughter in Spanish. I proudly raised my hand and I said, mijo. This is what my whole family called me, and my female cousins were called mija, and so I thought I was right. He looked at the whole class and said, you Mexicans can't be bringing your slang into this class. It is lazy and incorrect. The correct word is hijo. And for a long time, I thought he was correct. Not about the word, because technically he is correct, but about the sentiment that I and my culture are inherently lazy and incorrect. To be raised in Mexican culture is to be raised by women. In Coco and other Latin A movies, such as Encanto, the female head of the family is perceived as strong, wise, and a survivor of hard times, and honestly, kinda mean. This is true of my grandmother as well. You can say she ran a tight ship, whose own measure of success was weighed by how well her children and grandchildren lived and thrived, and how quickly and well the cycle of poverty was broken, the only cycle she knew. Now, I do not think for a moment that strong women are a Latina exclusive, but the cultural difference might be this. Growing up, my favorite memories as a child are when we would have huge parties in her house, with my multitude of aunts and uncles and cousins, all squeezed into her tiny little, that kitchen that you see before you. When you would show up, you would have to weave your way through the crowds and make a beeline for my grandmother to pay your respects, to say hello. And she would grab you and she would hug on you and love on you and tell me things in Spanish that I never understood. And then when she was done, not when you were done, but when she was done, you would then go pay respects to your aunts. Then your aunts would check on you, see how you're doing, and then feed you extensively. Jesus says, in my Father's house there are many rooms. I'm going there to prepare a place for you. Like John said, many of the beliefs and practices depicted in this movie precede European colonization and the spread of Christianity. And we have held on to many of these beliefs, not only because we are a stubborn people, but because I believe they are congruent with the teachings of Scripture. So when I hear Jesus saying things like this, the first thing I think of is he's going to need a big room for me and my family. And secondly, I see this picture that Coco first showed me. And I see one of those rooms, just one of them, many, many, many rooms in that picture, packed tightly with those who love me and those who I love, and with what my grandmother wanted for us to have enough. My immigrant grandmother wanted her children and grandchildren to have enough. And in that little room, we had enough. And that's what heaven looks like to me. And like John said, my grandmother's legacy will live on through my family's memories, and through stories just like this. And the reality is I don't think I had these words before the movie Coco. And when I watched it the first time, and when I watched it again last night, I bawled my eyes out. My culture has always been depicted with gang violence, drug and alcohol use, day laborers, and being lesser than. It wasn't until I saw this movie that I finally felt the beauty and richness of my culture correctly depicted on the screen for people to see. And while I don't need a corporate entity to give my life validation, it was cool to see myself on the big screen having an adventure, making mistakes, and finding redemption. The last thing I want to leave you with is this. So many cultures have so many things in common because I believe love and God transcend geography. You have to just be willing to look close enough. My wife and I's favorite musician, Hozier, an Irishman, has a song called Butchered Tongues, a song of what language means to an oppressed people. In that song, he says, "So far from home to have a stranger call you darling, and have your guarded heart be lifted like a child up by the hand." Darling is a term of endearment, and ultimately love elders tell their children. One of my mentors, my Uncle Augustine, came to visit my mom last week. And when he saw me, he gave me a big hug and called me mijo. The feeling of comfort and joy and safety I felt from hearing that word, I can't describe. Thanks to the movie Coco and this sermon series, I learned a better translation for what I thought the bastardization or the conjugation of mi hijo, or my son, mi hija, my daughter. And the better translation is darling, a term of endearment and love. So thank you.
Thank you, Philip. And look at those ears match. That's a great... So the story of Coco surrounds Miguel, who you see there, who loves music and wants to be a musician. But because his great-great-grandfather allegedly abandoned his family to pursue a music career, his great-great-grandmother forbid not just the playing of music, but anybody listening to music. To support herself after her husband left, she learned how to make shoes. And as her family grew, so did the shoe business, so that when we joined the story 5 generations later, the entire family is involved in the Rivera shoemaking business. And yet, rather than celebrating that accomplishment, how she overcame the odds against her as a single mother and building this empire of her whole family being supported by one business, they still can't do anything with music. But Miguel is expected to go into the shoemaking business, but he wants to make music. And when he comes to believe that Ernesto de la Cruz, who's reported to be the greatest musician in Mexican history, when he believes that he is that missing ancestor, his great-great-grandfather, he believes that music is in his blood, that is his destiny, which causes them to get into an argument with his grandmother on the evening of the Day of the Dead. So if you'll play that. So after that happens, Miguel flees into the plaza to compete in a music competition, but having no guitar, too far there. Having no guitar, he breaks into Ernesto de la Cruz's tomb in order to steal the guitar. As soon as he strums the strings, he's magically transported somehow to the land of the dead. And there he encounters his relatives, including Mama Imelda, who put the original ban on music. And to return to the land of the living, he has to receive a blessing from his family. And Mama Imelda says that she will only give him the blessing if he will not perform any music when he goes back to the land of the living. None of the other family members will give that blessing because, in my interpretation, they're all afraid of Mama Imelda. And so he sets off instead, thinking that De La Cruz is his great-great-grandfather, to get his blessing from him. Instead, goes through many adventures on the way, meeting a man named Hector, who is trying to cross back into the land of the living in order to see his daughter Coco for one last time because she is forgetting him, and his picture is not found on any ofrendas. And because it's not on ofrendas, he can't cross back to the land of the living. And as soon as you're not remembered by anybody on earth, then you disappear. So quick condensing the story, major spoiler alert, it turns out that Hector is actually Miguel's great-great-grandfather. And he didn't come home out of choice, that he was actually murdered by Ernesto de la Cruz so that he could steal Hector's songs so that he could become famous. So Miguel ends up convincing his family to help Hector to get the picture back into the land of the living, getting onto an ofrenda so that he will be remembered, so that he can see Coco again. Mama Imelda says that she will not forgive Hector for what he did, even finding out that he had been murdered, but will help try to get the picture back across. And Miguel says, even if you don't forgive him, he shouldn't be forgotten. And so the family gets into a fight with De La Cruz, and Mama Imelda ends up on the stage of De La Cruz's stage show, which ends the Day of the Dead, and what she does surprises everyone. And so don't ask Philip to interpret that song, apparently. Definitely don't ask me. I took Latin and French. But it turns out that it wasn't just losing her husband that causes her this pain, but it was also losing their singing together that caused her pain. That in losing Hector, Mama Imelda also lost her music, her love to sing. And if I were to give this message again sometime in the future, I think I would do it on the power of music. But to try and stop that hurt that she has, she shuts down music for everyone else. But did that really stop the pain? No. Because apparently, 100 years or so later, she's still unable to forgive. She still holds that pain, that anger in her heart. And the pain now has been transmitted generationally. As I continue to say, not original to me, hurt people hurt people. If healing doesn't take place, then that hurt gets passed on to other people. In this case, it gets passed on generationally. That she has continued to carry this weight she has, this anger and animosity, again, not just losing Hector, but also losing music. And then, again, it blocks her off from being able to celebrate the amazing thing that she has done in starting up this business that her whole family, 5 generations later, is participating in. But Mama Imelda's pain continues to the 5th generation, bringing pain to her great-great-grandson, whom she has never even met. So this week, in a move I'm attributing to the movement of the Holy Spirit, someone sent me a message, sort of a meme that said, "One mistake you should never make in your life is to allow yourself to be recruited by someone to hate another person who hasn't wronged you. Only a fool inherits other people's enemies as a sign of loyalty." Now, this wasn't about, they didn't send this to me because I was addressing this in today's message. They had no idea. Instead, it's about hating other people because the leader of your tribe says, hate this person, right? We can see that happening in our culture. But the meaning ends up being the same, even if I might use some nicer language there at the end. My grandfather was adopted, and the story we were told growing up was actually not what it turned out of how he was adopted when my brother was doing genealogy of the family. We are told that his mother had died in childbirth, and so he was put up for adoption as an infant. But it turns out that he was actually adopted when he was 6 or 7 years old. More than likely, his mother, who was the one who forced to put up for adoption, was a schizophrenic. Again, more mental illness in my side of the family. And the family he was adopted into gave him their last name. He wanted to change his last name, but never did. My brother and I both changed our last names as adults to go back to a family name, so which is my parents and I don't have the same last name. But his adoptive family was abusive so much that he ran away for the first time at 14 years old. So that's 3 or 4 generations ago. I can certainly see some things that have passed down to me generationally, but should I hate my great-grandmother for what she did? She hasn't hurt me, and it would make even less sense for me to be telling my daughters, you should hate this person because 5 generations ago, she hurt your great-great-grandfather. That's what we see happening here. And it does happen because hate and hurts can become generational. Because it's what we are taught, what we are told is right, how we are shown to live out our lives, it gets passed down. Think of people you know, or maybe even some of you, who were told what you were expected to do for your profession. Right? Maybe it was to go into the family business, as Miguel is supposed to do. I certainly know people who were told, right, if you don't go to college for this degree, I won't pay for your college. Normally fathers who are saying that. Right? You need to be doing this because that's what I expect of you. And when they don't do those things, what happens? Right? Anger, abuse, exile from the family. It is believed that the majority of people who are abusers were also abused themselves. That they are passing their pain and hurt on generationally because it's how they were brought up, and so they're continuing that on. Their pain and hurt is moving forward and hurting new generations. So Linda's father was abused when he was a child, although he never talked about that. But in talking with his brother-in-law, who told us some stories of what happened to her father's sister, pretty gruesome activities that her grandfather did. And more than likely, he was abused by his father and on back how many generations, we don't know. But in praise of both Linda's father and his sister, neither of them abused their children. They stopped that pattern. They stopped that abuse from continuing on generationally. And the same could have been true for generations up to Miguel. That they were fighting a fight that wasn't theirs anymore. They were angry about a hurt that wasn't done to them. And yet, because no healing had taken place in the family, that hurt continued not because of Hector leaving, but because the family continued this pain, this hurts for generations, even though it had nothing to do with them anymore. And I know it might sound harsh. I mean, like I'm being harsh to Mama Imelda and some of the characters in this movie. But I think we can understand why she was hurt, why she was upset, right? Why she tried to set these boundaries and rules to try and protect herself. But it didn't protect her because it never brought healing. At some point, it needed to stop. Someone needed to say, I'm not being disloyal to the family by listening to music, let alone playing music. What happened was terrible, right? But let's celebrate the accomplishments of what happened because of that, how we have redeemed ourselves, and let's bring healing back in. That the family needed to stop to be stronger for restoration to take place. To stop the iniquities of mothers and fathers and aunts and uncles and friends and strangers from traveling on to the third and fourth generation or even longer. It's about, right, Linda's dad saying, I am not going to abuse my children. Even though that's how I was taught what it means to be a father, I'm going to stop that in this generation. It's about saying, right, the way I was raised didn't help me to deal with conflicts. So I'm going to have to learn how to do that or to be in relationship better or all those things that get passed on generationally because it's how we learn to live and say, I'm going to do better in this generation so that 5 generations from now they will be doing even better themselves. to bring healing and wholeness to our lives so that it'll pass on to future generations. Because do things go to the third and fourth generation? Yes. Sometimes great things and sometimes terrible things. What we need to do is to understand, to give forgiveness or to seek forgiveness where that's needed. And decide we are not going to pass on this pattern. That we are going to stop and say, no, even if doing so gets us criticized or attacked, maybe even excluded from the family because it's the right thing to do not only for us, but for future generations. That what we do now is not just for now, but sets patterns that can go on for years and years, both good and bad. Jesus says the man that is born blind, it's not because of his sins, it's not because of the sins of his parents, but so that he might see God's work done, that God's work might be glorified in some other translations of that. And I'm reading a book right now, gives a different interpretation of that about disability in the church, and Camille will be leading a class on that book in the fall, so cliffhanger for that. But the same is true with us, that we can be the ones who stop hate and violence, who can stop unhealthy behaviors and unhealthy activities. It's not just to change our fate, to quote from the movie last week, but to change the fate of those yet to come. So at the end of the film, Miguel has received his blessing. Mama Imelda has allowed him to go back and to play music, and he sits down next to Coco to help her remember her father. And in this moment, the family is changed, and then there's a cut which moves to celebration 1 year later. So I'm going to invite you to get out your scripture insert, again, for those who are worshiping on this online, to have a piece of paper. And we're going to take a minute to sort of reflect on that. Maybe it's to celebrate, right, what has been passed on to us. Maybe it's to celebrate those things that we stopped from passing on to future generations. Or maybe it might be those things that we want to stop. And how do we do that? So if you'll take a minute to reflect on that.